I'm teaching about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, I usually begin with this image, this idea of the dissident writer who exposed the Soviet Union's labor camp system, exposed all that to the world, and that's the best place to start. But really, it's not the entire story. Solzhenitsyn was born in 1918 in Kislovodsk in southern Russia. And he grew up in a world that was, of course, shaped by the revolution, and then there was the Civil War, and then the rise of the new Soviet order. And long before Solzhenitsyn became famous, he was already living inside the political system he would later challenge so powerfully. When he was a young man, he studied mathematics at Rostov State University, and that detail, it really matters because it reminds us that he did not begin as this public literary figure like so many other authors. He also studied independently, and he really thought seriously about writing from early on. Now, that combination is quite interesting for him because he had the disciplined, structured side of a mathematician, but he was also drawn toward history and ideas, and he really enjoyed fiction. And in a way, both of those sides really kind of stayed with him because his writing could be morally forceful, but also just it's emotionally intense. But really, it has this kind of like documentary patience to it. And like for so many people, World War II it changed everything. Solzhenitsyn served as an officer in the Red Army, and he fought against Nazi Germany. But in 1945, he was arrested not for cowardice or collaboration, but he was criticizing Joseph Stalin in his private letters. And that arrest led to years of imprisonment and also internal exile within the Soviet Union. And this becomes one of the most important central facts of his life because the camp experience didn't just affect him personally. It became the foundation for the writing that would later make him world famous. And that's because he happened to know the Soviet prison system from the inside. Now, after Stalin died, Solzhenitsyn eventually emerged from exile and began writing in a way that the Soviet Union really couldn't fully control. And the great breakthrough came when, with the writing of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And that was published in 1962 as a book that I was introduced to as a sophomore in high school. And the novel is short. It's almost a novella. But its importance is, it was enormous. It gave Soviet and international readers a direct look, literary look, at life inside a gulag, inside a labor camp. And for a brief moment during the Khrushchev era, it appeared possible that truth about the system might actually be spoken openly. But unfortunately, that opening really didn't last. Soviet authorities turned against Solzhenitsyn. They banned his later works, and they expelled him from the Writers' Union. And they basically treated him as an enemy of the state, an internal enemy. And then what made him a threat, and especially powerful, was that he was not merely criticizing one policy or one political official. He was exposing the moral structure of the entire system. And it's because his writing insisted that repression and fear and lies weren't side effects. They were actually built into the way that Soviet power operated. And his reputation is going to grow, became even larger with the Gulag Archipelago, which was published in the West beginning in 1973. Now, this isn't a conventional novel. It's not something that's normal. It's this enormous, this vast literary historical work that's built from the testimony and the memory and investigation, and then also it's based upon like a moral indictment of what was happening. It forced readers around the world to really confront the scale and the logic behind the Soviet camp system. And when it comes down to it, whatever else people think about Solzhenitsyn, this book changed the entire understanding, the global understanding of Soviet repression. And by the time the world understands what's really going on, Solzhenitsyn had already received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970, and the Nobel Committee honored him for what it called the ethical force of his work and his continuation of the indispensable traditions of Russian literature. And that phrasing is important. That phrasing matters because it gets at what made Solzhenitsyn distinctive. He wasn't just exposing injustice, he was doing it in a way that placed him inside this long tradition of Russian moral, but also literary seriousness. If you don't get that, you need to go back and read some Tolstoy and some Dostoevsky and understand where that, that hard-hitting seriousness really comes from. In 1974, the Soviet Union, the government expelled him from the country, and he lived a time in the West, and he eventually settled in the state of Vermont in the United States. And the exile made him an even more complicated as a public figure, because he was admired by many for his courage, but he also frustrated people because they expected him to become, this very simple Western liberal hero. But Solzhenitsyn was deeply Russian when it came to his identity and his outlook, and he was critical not only of Soviet-style communism, but also of what he saw as like spiritual weakness and the decadence and the materialism in the modern Western world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia in 1994, and by then he had become more than just a writer. He was this historical witness. He was seen as a symbol of morality, and for some, he was this deeply controversial thinker. He died in 2008, but his place in 20th century history and literary history is rather secure, because he remains one of the clearest examples of a writer whose work was not just literary in nature, but it was ambitious towards like the criticism of certain aspects of civilization, because he wanted literature to tell the truth about power and suffering and memory. And also he wanted literature to tell the truth about the human soul. And I really think that's why he matters so much. And I hope you learned something new here. He's one of my, it's difficult to say his works are some of my favorite, but they really hit home, and I understand the power and the passion and the dedication that he was writing with. I want to thank Mr. Bob Gillingham for introducing me to Solzhenitsyn when I was just 15 years old in high school way back when. But some stuff that really was profound and had a great impact on me. Thanks for taking the time, and I appreciate you watching.